blended and melded into the unmistakable sounds of Mexico City's traffic. People whistling and vendors shouting and swearing, and what I can only describe as a faded mix of excerpts of classic love songs from the 1930s, 1940s, La Época de Oro, or Mexico's golden age of cinema and the Mexican arts. The music was faded in the sense that there was a softer texture, like a comforting blanket that had been cherished, used, and worn so often over the years that it has become transparent in certain sections. The weaving rendered much thinner, evident of years and years of memories. Where this blanket was once used for physical warmth, its faded structure is fortified by the nostalgic warmth it now brings. The interweaving of multiple sonic snapshots had me completely immersed into the groove, and I felt a sudden sense of calm and relief, accompanied by waves of nostalgia for outings and walks with my abuelitas, my two grandmothers, one who had left us to be with the ancestors back in 2005, and the other still living at the time, and back home with my family, sadly no longer able to walk due to Parkinson's. As I remembered my abuelitas, I was suddenly no longer on La Micro, having just walked into a scene that reminded me so much of my abuelita Jesucita's bedroom in El Paso, Texas, after she had moved with my parents when I was born. A room I remember all too well from countless afternoons and evenings of sitting with her on her rock-solid daybed next to multiple photographs of family members, alive and dead, as well as trinkets and items dating back to the 1920s in Jalpa, Zacatecas, that radiated a complex nostalgia and trauma from the post-revolutionary period. When she wasn't singing to me from the collection of classic songs of her youth, or telling me stories from the post-revolutionary life in the highlands, we spent most nights watching black and white films featuring Pedro Infante and Jorge Negrete, stars of Mexico's golden age of cinema, who would always burst into songs and that would soon become staples of a time gone by. Ageless, the corazon or heart of a nostalgia for the old Mexico, my grandmother's Mexico. As a child, I internalized the fact that there existed two Mexicos, one that belonged to my grandparents and my parents, and one that existed when we traveled to visit family. And then there was also La Frontera, or the border, which belonged to me, an in-between world. As I entered this bedroom, the sound of Pedro Infante singing Amorcito Corazón, with a famous whistle from Blanca Estela Pavón in the 1948 film Nosotros los Pobres, filled me with nostalgia as I entered the scene of an elderly person rocking back and forth in a chair who could easily be my abuelita. It was raining outside, and the sounds of rain served as a descant to Amorcito Corazón, coming from the image of Pedro Infante on the screen on top of an old TV. Similar to the music I had heard on the bus, the track sounded faded, like a pair of jeans that were loved so much that the color washed out in certain areas. And the faded areas were filled in with relaxing lo-fi beats and MIDI keyboard ornamentation. Just as I realized that I should probably find a moment to erase my way out of this surreal yet comforting break to get back to the task at hand, my ears were violated by an obnoxious sound screaming from an anthropomorphic emu, "Liberty Mutual Insurance!" That damn ad. I hated that ad. I still hate that ad because it still follows me to this day every time I listen to anything on YouTube. To add insult to injury, my husband burst through the room and moved the right side of my headphones to ask, "Hey, how's chapter 4 going?" The proverbial halt and record scratch that brings one back to reality. And as you have probably guessed, I was never actually on La Microbus, nor was I in my abuelita's bedroom listening to Pedro Infante. It was the peak period of COVID-19 quarantine, and I had recently discovered this amazing audiovisual playlist on YouTube by content creator Palma Sur, seemingly curated especially for me, despite knowing this was not the case. As my dissertation nears its 5th birthday this year, I reflect on how I owe so much to the Mexican lo-fi online community and many content creators that uploaded sonic scenes that transported me outside of the tiny nook of my office in which I was forced to physically reside during quarantine. I sincerely feel to this day that el lo-fi mexa me salvó la vida. Mexican lo-fi saved my life, my mental health, and in all likelihood also saved my dissertation. And quite appropriately, El Lo-Fi Mexa Me Salvó La Vida is the title of what the Mexican lo-fi community considers one of the seminal Spotify playlists, curated and compiled by content creators Solosan and El Triste, drawing inspiration from Palma Sur and other Mexican lo-fi content creators and online DJs, lo-fi compositions on YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook. YouTube serving as a primary space for curation, creation, and consumption for Mexican lo-fi, similar to its US-based and Japanese-based predecessors of audiovisual composition, on playlists created specifically as lo-fi beats to study to, relax to, and just vibe to, and exist to, a calming soundtrack for every moment, which I will explain in more detail further on. Drawing on the theoretical intersection of Mexican music, memory, and identity, I analyzed how Mexican lo-fi's evocation of nostalgia and romanticized Mexican identity provides sonic refuge and coping mechanisms beyond the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of my analysis, and as I exemplified in my anecdotal self-reflection in the introduction to this paper, I utilized autohistoria teoria, a specific theoretical and critical approach through creative exploration of self-knowledge and autohistories, coined and defined by renowned Chicana feminist and border scholar Gloria Anzaldúa. By contextualizing my personal experience as a post-migrant Mexican-American and border kid, and post-pandemic introduction to the world of Mexican lo-fi, I positioned my own inherited cultural memory, nostalgia, and identity formation within this framework of Anzaldúa's autohistoria as a social practice of knowing self and understanding my own complex generation of Mexican-American identity, to better understand and relate to the collective self and identity of Mexican and Mexican-Americans who engage in online communities of Mexican nostalgic musical and artistic practices. I've explored furthermore how Mexican lo-fi's community creation transcends temporal and physical boundaries, transporting listeners, particularly Mexican migrants and diaspora communities, to homeland. Through sounds they fear time and or distance will forever render a memory unattainable and confined to the past. I argue that the Mexican lo-fi community, including passive listeners who stumble on Mexican lo-fi content, embody Benedict Anderson's definition of imagined communities, comprised of Mexicans, Mexican migrants in the US, those who have living memory of the nostalgic scenes, and those with inherited memory of a romanticized Mexico that permanently resides through snapshots and animation. There we go. First and foremost, hold on, just a second, Pedro. There we go. Sorry. First and foremost, let's listen to some of the audio that I described in my introduction. You could argue that I have curated a short playlist for all of you and invite you here today into this world that blurs past and present. As students and even as academic professionals, our disciplines traditionally, and might I add erroneously, demand the absence of self in our production and sharing of knowledge, justified by the censoring of our personal lens and prioritization of unbiased analyses and critiques. Gloria Anzaldúa, like many of us in this room who are aware of or who have experienced dramatic shifts in the field, understand that biases within social sciences and humanities cannot be rejected, as the validity of unbiased analysis is a myth. In her conceptualization of autohistoria teoria, Gloria Anzaldúa considers attempts toward unbiased critical analyses as a rejection of self in the production of knowledge, and it severs oneself from a larger community and larger conversations. So to expand on the crossing of temporal and imaginary borders, I want to briefly revisit my description of Amorcito Corazon, the remix by Palma Sur, accompanied by the image of an elderly person on that rocking chair. So here's the original movie clip, and we had already heard the remix. And then, of course, here's the scene that I was talking about with the older person in the rocking chair. So what is lo-fi? Lo-fi refers to the term low fidelity in opposition to high fidelity sound. A subgenre of pre-digital hip-hop, lo-fi music attained popularity in the 2000s, 2010s with the emergence of bedroom producers who sought to cultivate a nostalgic aesthetic by mixing tracks and noise with slow-tempo beats through studio production, often literally in their own bedroom. As social media and streaming platforms became an integral community space for production and exchange, lo-fi became a refuge for relaxation, escape, and even concentration for work and school. Some of us here may be familiar with YouTube audiovisual playlists or content that invokes specific scenes and sounds of nature, rain, wind, white noise, often titled sleep sounds or relaxation sounds. Most millennials and Gen Z individuals often relate the merging of curated sonic spaces and low-fidelity beats with Lo-Fi Girl, a product of a subgenre of YouTube content creation known as StudyTube. StudyTube exploded during post-pandemic quarantine life, and I absolutely loved it, and obligatory online education. It definitely existed before as content creation by college-age students who would upload video diaries of college life. Many of them were called Study With Me videos, in which they recorded 1 hour or multi-hour sessions to offer viewers inspirational mirroring content in which students feel inspired to work alongside or feel that intentional elevated volume of keyboard clicks and pen to paper writing makes it easier for them to study. Some of the content production overlaps with lo-fi videos entitled Beats to Write an Essay To, oftentimes accompanied an iteration of the aforementioned Lo-Fi Girl, who has her own 24/7 live stream and with nearly 15 million subscribers. May I introduce you to Niña Lo-Fi, or Mexican Lo-Fi Girl, directly inspired from the OG Lo-Fi Girl, who, like the original Lo-Fi Girl, has many versions and artistic iterations as a referential visual to different types of Mexican lo-fi music, a soundtrack to every memory or daily life within the Mexican experience. In one of content creator Yosahandri Lia's TikTok videos, educating subscribers on the origins of Mexican lo-fi, he begins his video by asking in Spanish, "Do you know the uniquely Mexican musical genre that relaxes you and increases concentration? This is called lo-fi mexicano, or lo-fi mexa." Echoing other content creators such as Palma Sur and Solo-san, Yosahandri explains that Mexican lo-fi was a glorified pandemic baby, born into an uncertain physical world marked by anxiety and isolation. Solo-san, among Mexican and non-Mexican content creators, regards the overarching genre of lo-fi as a subgenre of hip-hop that is basically music to relax to. He continues to delineate the unique nature of lo-fi mexa by rhetorically inquiring to subscribers, "But did you know that there is an entire scene of Mexican content producers who seek to mix the essence of low-fidelity music with all of the nostalgic elements that represent us as Mexicans?" Whereas YouTube provides a full experience, both sonic and visual, of Mexican lo-fi, listeners and consumers wishing to prioritize sonic engagement can do so on Spotify through creator or community-curated playlists, most notably Solo-san and El Triste's playlist called El Lo-Fi Mexa Me Salvó la Vida. TikTok videos are generally much shorter than YouTube and are designed specifically for brief content engagement and more variety, distinguished by their vertical video frame as opposed to the horizontal frame of a YouTube video. However, YouTube does remain the primary audiovisual platform for Mexican lo-fi content. TikTok now serves as more of a POV or point of view introduction where you can feel like you're in the room with the content creators. Solo-san credits content creator Palma Sur as the brainchild of Lo-Fi Mexa, who, combining his love for Mexican culture and his knowledge of Mexican production, created this movement, and thus gives voice to those sonorous elements that make us Mexican. La micro, tamales, el tianguis, or the swap meet, and so much more. Solo-san is referring specifically to the hundreds of audiovisual Lo-Fi Mexa videos that depict daily Mexican life, and including more recent pop music since the 2000s. Regional and temporal identities lie at the core of a significant percentage of Mexican lo-fi content. Many videos and audiovisual mixes are centered on different boroughs of Mexico City, though listeners can often project their specific hometown or localities to the images presented in each respective video. A select few are based on rural regions of Mexico, evoking different scenes and collective memories of family and social life. A few others centered on borders and border crossing experiences. However, specifically from the perspective of family and community members who remain in Mexico, and I will talk more about this later on. The scenes are coded to the Mexican experience, including the two Mexicos that I spoke of earlier, the current or new Mexico and the old Mexico, both invoking and evoking nostalgia through audiovisual mediums. The current or New Mexico, and new in quotations, do not confuse it with the state of New Mexico, which is very different, draws heavily on living memory of its listeners, specifically those who currently reside in, or in the case of young migrants who emigrated as older children, teens, or young adults, recently resided in Mexico. The old Mexico is a romanticized and imagined invocation of a golden age, a Mexican life stripped of the hardships from the post-revolutionary and World War II Mexican period, defined solely by a community-curated filter, figurative and literal, if we are considering the sonic and visual filters used on lo-fi Mexa content. I emphasize, however, that a significant number of Mexican lo-fi content blends the new Mexico and old Mexico, not only through the fluid overlapping waves of specifically curated samples, but also through the visual codification of animation and images of objects that index specific elements of Mexican identity. One of my favorite examples of this nostalgic holiday-themed Mexican lo-fi Posada Navideñas, an iteration of Mexican lo-fi girl wearing a Christmas-themed sweater, drinking out of a Santa Claus mug, and studying with her headphones, while all the while you can see a group of young people presumably singing carols in the street outside her room. Again, this and similar content is codified specifically to a blend of contemporary Mexican lived experience and inherited memory nostalgia. This is most evident in my favorite artistic touch, which is the plushie of El Dr. Simi, which I want to talk about much later, and I don't have time to talk about this. But the most important part of this is the fact that it uses an older Christmas carol called Los Peces en el Río, which is something that is most associated with previous generations and not necessarily current generations. So let's listen to this really fast. I know that I'm running out of time still. So we love Mexican lo-fi girl, but we have to move on. So I did want to show briefly how some of this intersects with my current work and my current monograph project about immigration. And what's really fascinating about the immigration intersections with Mexican lo-fi is that it's from the perspective of the Mexican people that were left behind, that remained in Mexico. And I have this example in which they don't actually sing the lyrics, but in the content description they include this poem that says, "So many have left this place, only the old ones remain, and the faint reflections of other voices in other songs. No one works the fields, everyone went to the north without a visa or passport. They left destination unknown. Only the path remains where the Mexicans once walked, and no one waits for their brother in this empty train station." And it does have this almost tragic nostalgia element to it. So this is just, the beginnings of what I hope is an ongoing project. And I definitely look forward to your comments and suggestions and feedback because it's very much in its early stages. I do, however, want to take the time to invoke specific memories of communities in this moment, not only of that of my abuelitas to whom I always dedicate my work, but more specifically to our migrant and undocumented migrant communities and other marginalized communities in the US, who so often feel safest in these digital spaces, unpatrolled by ICE raids and anti-immigrant violent and vitriolic political rhetoric in mass media and from the United States presidential administration. And as Solo-san so eloquently stated in one of his TikTok videos on the history of Mexican lo-fi, and with that, in my short curated playlist, I leave you with this outro of Sabor a Mí. Thank you so much. You all kind of want to relax. Sorry. All right. Sure.
So thank you, Teresita. Do we have any questions or comments from the audience? Don't be shy.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting presentation, and it's great to see other people doing work on cultural manifestations of communities in diaspora on YouTube in the pandemic moment. I'd invite you to. I imagine you just got here pretty recently because we presented on my colleague Daniel Margulies and I presented on a book that we recently put out about musical responses to COVID in Latin America through YouTube. And I was wondering, like, what within these channels, do you see like a particular structure of moderators? Is there like a chat function? Are people participating in a chat? Or is this mostly music that people put on and listen to and sort of consume as an audiovisual project? Because one thing that we saw a lot during the pandemic was a lot of these YouTube channels that would have a stream and that would have sort of a chat attached that would allow people to communicate with one another, share stories, experiences, and sort of replicate that sort of that quasi-social affect within a digital space.
Sure, so that's a great question. And yes, I'm familiar with your work, Jay. I think it's fantastic, and I know that we have plenty to talk about, so I appreciate you bringing that up. In terms of comments and chats, they do happen during live streams, but they're not the same as the 24/7 live stream of the original Lo-Fi Girl, where you have people that sometimes comment, and most of them are saying, "Hey, who's working a paper at 3 a.m.? Me!" And then there's other people that chime in. But it's mostly in YouTube comments that are left afterward, because a lot of people really stumble on this when it's not live, and most of the time, the DJs curate it very specifically to visuals, and so there's not really that opportunity to present it live. But I know that there are some instances, but I don't feel like that structure is quite there yet, in my experience. But that's a great question.
Hi, thank you so much for a terrific paper. Piggybacking off that comment about comments from in YouTube, I was wondering if there are comments from the lo-fi makers themselves, like people like Solasan or El Triste, about like their influences or their motivations, like if they've been influenced by electrocumbia or things like that. What have they said themselves about what they're doing?
Oh, definitely. And like each of these are snapshots of different parts of daily life. So some of them are called like waiting in line to cash out at the OXXO, which is a gas station. And so they'll actually blend in music that modern music or like popular music now that will be playing probably on like Muzak or something in the gas station. And also things that are popular like in dancing halls or when you hear people playing things on the street when they're washing their car. So they're really meant to be like these snapshots of life that you can relate to. But I'm sure that they have talked about it in their TikTok videos. So TikTok is kind of the commentary portion of this, and YouTube is the immersion experience, and they communicate that way. And that's where kind of this project is going next, of how these two different platforms are used very differently to communicate with the community and keep kind of fortifying the community.
Great, thank you.
We do have time for one more.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, Teresita. Seeing your presentation, I have one question. Do you know if there is any relationship between this lo-fi community and Sonideros?
Oh.
Do they have any relationship? Because, of course, this is a virtual community and Sonideros is a bit different, but at the same time, I can notice a lot, like, different points of convergence.
I have not explored that, but it would not surprise me because there's so many collisions of worlds on the internet, as you know, where you have, especially with like musical fan fiction almost, of like these like imaginary meetings between two completely different artists that live in very different times, and then it kind of turns into more content creation. So that would be something I would want to explore, but don't have an answer for you at this moment. Yeah, but thank you, Juan.
Let's all thank Teresita one more time.
Thank you
for
so
this
much.
wonderful presentation. Great way to get started. these scenarios where I am both presenter and session host are a little bit awkward, because who wants to read a bio about themselves, especially in the third person? Well, it'd probably be more awkward in the first person. So I am Greg Reach, and I'm director of the Center for Popular Music and professor of musicology at Middle Tennessee State University. And I do a lot of different things, so that's my bio. I'm going to talk to you today about El Mundo se va a acabar, a tradition, innovation, and pan-latinidad in 1990s son jarocho, with a focus on a pair of albums by Grupo Mono Blanco. Let me pull that up, and we'll get started. The traditional music and dance of southern Veracruz, Mexico, generally known as son jarocho, has undergone two major geographical and stylistic expansions. The first occurred in the early to mid-20th century, as jarocho musicians brought their music to the cities, particularly Mexico City, and professionalized it with new standards of virtuosity, showmanship, repertoire, and other aspects of performance practice. These changes stemmed from developments in the nation's media and entertainment industries, including the rise of Mexican radio, commercial recordings, and cinema, the pan-Mexican extravaganza of the baile folklorico, and the burgeoning tourism industry. This polished style later became known somewhat derisively as jarocho blanco, a reference to the pressed white outfits that performers generally wear in these professional contexts. Side note, for a revised, nuanced case study of this development with jarocho blanco and the move into the cities and so on, I strongly recommend the recent book about musician Mario Barradas, came out from UT Press, I think 2 years ago, with three co-authors, Yolanda Broyles Gonzalez, Francisco Gonzalez, and Rafael Figueroa. A great book and a great contribution to the literature. The second son jarocho expansion began in the latter part of the century as a product of the jarocho revival, known also as El Renacimiento, the rebirth, or El Movimiento, the movement. The revival, perhaps ironically, began as a reaction to the first expansion, to the standardization of jarocho blanco as a form of professional mass media entertainment, allegedly detached from the genre's folkloric origins. In the late 1970s, a group of mostly younger Veracruzanos launched a project to reclaim the tradition's regional, community-oriented contexts and performance styles, using the resources of various governmental, cultural, and academic institutions. Central to the revivalist project was the construction of a new fandango practice, the participatory music, poetry, and dance events that had been part of the genre's pre-commercial existence in the pueblos of southern Veracruz, but was now reimagined in urban and festival settings as a communal gathering for those devoted to the political and cultural ideals of the movement. In the ensuing decades, the spread of the revivalist fandango ideal has taken son jarocho well beyond its roots in southern Veracruz, with scenes today flourishing in various parts of Mexico, South America, the United States, Canada, Europe, and even Japan. Along with the spread of participatory fandango practice, the revival also hatched a new generation of professional or semi-professional jarocho performing groups. The first wave of these groups included de facto leaders of the movimiento. Their performance and recording project often sought to demonstrate a purported return to the older rural styles and repertoire that flourished in southern Veracruz before the process of commercialization. And here's just one clear example from a group called Zacamandu in the album from 1992 called Antiguos Sones Jarocho. It's a very clear statement about what they're trying to do with this record. What interests me today in this presentation is how the leading ensemble of the revival, Grupo Mono Blanco, while promoting an ideal of folkloric authenticity and communal participation, simultaneously opened the door to an explicitly innovative and experimental approach to son jarocho that eventually became known as jarocho fusion. The emergence of jarocho fusion from the same movement that advocated for a faithful return to traditionalism seems, at least superficially, to present something of paradox. It must be noted here, though obvious and glaring to any of us who have considered the tangled culture of Veracruz, that Son Jarocho, even in its regional and pre-commercial manifestations, has always been a fusion, thoroughly connected to the region's history of European colonialism and the Atlantic trade in enslaved African people. We also need to resist oversimplified denotations of the terms tradition and innovation, which should not be understood as antipodal. Nonetheless, we might at least wonder how a movement whose main goals included the preservation of nearly lost practices also managed to unleash a new and commercialized subgenre, whose main goals included free experimentation and novel, theoretically limitless practices. Nowhere is this mystery more succinctly expressed than in the two albums that Grupo Mono Blanco released in 1997. Taken together, Sones Jarochos Volumen 5 and El Mundo Se Va a Acabar demonstrate the full spectrum of Jarocho revivalism. The former, an unvarnished performance of traditional pieces by the group's 3 core members, and the latter, an eclectic assortment of mostly original compositions performed by a collective of Latinx, African, and other musicians. Before going any further, let's take a moment to let our ears absorb the breadth of the stylistic range presented in these 2 releases. First, a few seconds of El Buscapiés from Volumen 5. It's a traditional song that is standard among musicians of what Mike Seeger would have called the true vine. Next, from El Mundo Se Va a Acabar, a sample of El Aguacero. Oh, excuse me, Malaya. I changed my mind at the last minute. Same group, released in the same year, not necessarily recorded in the same year. As surprising as the coincident release of these 2 albums by the same group is the fact that they were both recorded not in Mexico, but in the same Berkeley, California studio called Muscle Tone. The central figures in this astonishing pair of releases were Gilberto Gutierrez, native of southern Veracruz, director of Grupo Mono Blanco, and leader of the Jarocho revival, and Eugene Rodriguez, a conservatory-trained Chicano guitarist originally from Southern California and founder of the long-running, highly successful nonprofit Community Music Academy, performing ensemble, and Grammy-winning music production company called Los Sensoples. Following a visit by Grupo Mono Blanco to California's Bay Area in 1989, during which they recorded an album for Chris Drackwitz's Arhuli Records, Rodriguez took a keen interest in the musical and cultural complexities of Son Jarocho, and how that all happened is an interesting story for another paper. With the help of Rodriguez and folklorist Barbara Rahm, Gilberto Gutierrez returned to California in 1992 and stayed for 3 years, supported by grants from the U.S.-Mexico Cultural Fund, which was the project of the Rockefeller Foundation, the FONCA, Fondo Nacional para la Cultura y las Artes, which is sort of the Mexican equivalent of the NEA, and local organizations like the Centro Cultural La Peña in Berkeley. Together they launched the Fandango Project, whose mission, according to Rodriguez, and I'm quoting him here, was to reintegrate cultural context into Mexican-American interpretation of traditional music and dance, end quote. Gutierrez, in his wisdom, had realized early on that his efforts to sow the seeds of Fandango culture as the central methodology of the Jarocho revival could not be limited to Veracruz nor even to Mexico. Rodriguez, for his part, understood that the communal and participatory nature of Fandango culture fit perfectly with his goals at Los Sensotles Academy, where he sought to foster pride among Mexican-American children and adults in their heritage through experiential learning. The various recording projects they undertook formed a valuable adjunct to the Fandango project, exploring and capturing the musicians' shared musical visions and allowing the production side of Los Sensotles to develop. Rodriguez also told me in conversation that he and Gutierrez simply wanted to make and record as much good music as possible during their time together without strict adherence to any academic ideals or dogmatism. Their first recording session took place in 1994 in what Rodriguez described as a dingy studio in the Mission District of San Francisco. The results were rough in some ways, but as we'll see, highly energetic and full of potential. Volumen 5 showcased just the three core members of Grupo Monoblanco at the time. Gilberto Gutierrez on jarana, Andres Vega on requinto jarocho, also known as guitarra de son, which is the lead melodic instrument for much of this that you'll hear, and Octavio Vega on harp and guitarra cuarta, kind of baritone version of the requinto. All three musicians sing on the recording, as is customary in son jarocho. While Rodriguez and Gutierrez have both insisted to me that the project had no lofty goal driving it, its effect surely seems to be a powerful demonstration of son jarocho music in what we might delicately call its purest form. Virtuosic musicians playing traditional sones in a stripped-down trio setting that reveals the richness of that tradition without distraction. It is, in other words, a compelling document of the revival's preservationist ideals. I'm going to play you a couple of brief excerpts. El Trompito is a solo performance by Monoblanco's requintero Andres Vega, an older generation musician that Gutierrez had recruited into the group for his unmatched skill on the instrument. Eugene Rodriguez has recalled that Vega's highly inventive use of Baroque-like figurations in his requinto playing was, in fact, one of the first traits of traditional son jarocho that caught his attention, Rodriguez's attention, and from which he continued to draw inspiration in his own guitar playing. So here's a little bit of Trompito solo performance by Andres Vega. Listen to that all day, as I've done. The album closes with a performance of the most famous son jarocho of them all, La Bamba. While it's not the least bit unusual for jarocho musicians to play La Bamba, its inclusion here might be construed as a revivalist counterbalance to the more familiar renditions of the song in popular culture, from Richie Valens to Jose Feliciano, Neil Diamond, Selena, and Mariachi Vargas. So, a purportedly authentic version of La Bamba. Sorry. What happened here? Try that again, sorry. While Volumen 5 evokes the rural and folkloric ethos of pre-commercial son jarocho, El Mundo Se Va a Acabar is a sharply different affair, a highly varied collection of songs and arrangements that puts son jarocho into cultural relief among various other Latin, African, and European idioms. Players recruited for the project were mostly local friends and collaborators of Eugene Rodriguez, who said that, I'm quoting, "We sought out open minds for crossover experiments and those with the skill of listening and using music as a conversational language," end quote. The lineup included the three aforementioned core members of Grupo Mono Blanco and Rodriguez himself, along with Peruvian-American bassist Jorge Pomar, Venezuelan-American percussionist Jacqueline Rago, Baroque-style violinist Shira Kamen, djembe player Babu Sagna, Nigerian Afro-rock legend Johnny Hastrup, who doesn't sing on the album but plays keg drum, Cuban tres player Sekou, and the Chicano guitarist of Los Lobos, David Hidalgo. There are 18 players in all that appear on the record. They chose the name Stone Lips, Grupo Mono Blanco y Stone Lips. They chose the name Stone Lips in reference to the famous colossal heads of Olmec civilization, which flourished in what is now southern Veracruz during the pre-classic period of Mesoamerican history. And that particular example of the Olmec head, which was uncovered in a little town in Veracruz called Tres Zapotes and is still on display there, that's actually Gilberto's hometown, Tres Zapotes. With such an assemblage of talents, it comes as no surprise that the album's 8 tracks cover a wide range of sounds and styles. The production approach was somewhat loose, with relatively little rehearsal to encourage greater experimentation and musico-cultural interaction during the recording sessions at Muscleton Studios. What happened? I didn't do anything. Rodriguez told me that they recorded the foundation of each track live, but added some overdubs later to achieve desired textures and cultural layers. Asked whether this overdubbing in any way contradicted his and Gutierrez's desire for creative spontaneity, he told me that sometimes, quote, "you just gotta do what you gotta do to get the desired effect." The songs themselves are a combination of original compositions by Gilberto Gutierrez and a couple of highly original approaches to traditional sones. One particularly intriguing example is the album's opening track, El Chuchumbe, now a standard of the son jarocho repertoire, but one whose history encapsulates many of the complexities of the revival movement. Scholars Alejo Carpentier and Daniel Sheehy both documented references to a song and dance called El Chuchumbe that came to Veracruz from Havana with Afro-Cuban slaves in the 1770s. Further archival research led Gilberto Gutierrez to several written verses transcribed in a 1779 church edict that bans performance of El Chuchumbe in Veracruz because of its references to lascivious body parts and movements, as well as its transgressive mockery of Spanish clergy. With verses in hand, but no record of the colonial era music, Gutierrez composed a jarocho-style melody, a simple but characteristic chord progression, and a pop-style refrain with a rhythmic hook that made it something of a hit among the revivalists. Another interesting example is El Son de Viento, the foundation of which came from the original session that Gutierrez and Rodriguez had recorded with Mono Blanco harpist Octavio Vega in that dingy studio in the Mission District at the start of the Fandango project. Some 2 years later, during the Stone Lips sessions, the co-producers decided to build on their improvised scratch tracks, composing a vocal melody and lyrics and overdubbing Shira Kamen's violin and Jorge Pomar's fretless electric bass to accentuate the airy chamber atmosphere of the texture. Although these examples and the remainder of the album include a plethora of sounds from and references to various musical cultures, I maintain that the compositional and production choices, the centering of Grupo Mono Blanco and the Son Jarocho tradition, the Spanish language and poetic forms, combine here to project Veracruzan son in a pan-Latin context that fits the broader project of the Jarocho revival. The presence of African and European elements in the music serves to highlight these facets of Veracruzan history and culture, and more broadly, Mexican and Latinx culture overall. Son Jarocho became a sonic embodiment of a rich and complicated history that Veracruz shares with the rest of Latin America. In the album's booklet notes, Rodriguez points out that he came to this realization through practical experience with the music, and I quote him here. Throughout the travels with Mono Blanco, there were many people who, upon hearing the music, claimed the Son Jarocho as their own. West African drummers immediately identified the rhythms and origins of the Son Jarocho as West African. East Indian musicians, Afro-Cuban soneros, as well as flamenco musicians of southern Spain, immediately identified with the rhythms, verse structures, and dances of the Son Jarocho. End quote. If the goals of the Fandango project and the Jarocho revival in general were to preserve the tradition by spreading the communal, participatory, low bar of entry spirit of the Fandango, then Jarocho fusion, a movement that started with this very record, offers an effective complement, an audible and commercially viable demonstration of how the sones of Veracruz can attain and express when played and reimagined by a diverse collection of high-caliber musicians in a pan-Latin context. Despite the many problems with the concept of a pan-Latinidad, its homogenization of Latin cultures, its foundation in colonialist worldviews and historical violence, its regular neglect of indigeneity, despite all that, Jarocho fusion as a revivalist genre offers a rich and common ground of shared identity and experience, one that continues to thrive to this day. Thank you. Questions or comments, anybody? Let's get you the mic.
Hi, I loved your paper. It brought me back. I'm originally from San Francisco, and I could have been one of the kids in the
Oh, is that
photo.
right?
I know Eugene and Huberto very well. In 1992 through 1994, my mom every Saturday used to take me to La Peña Cultural Center for the fandangos. And so in the morning, we'd have dance classes and music classes, and then we'd stay all day and night for the fandango. And it was a great experience, and as a kid, I had no idea how special that was until I got much older. So wow, this was incredible.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. And yeah, these albums were definitely, so important in that community. But then later, even in Los Angeles with the habanero movement that came a lot later, everyone refers back to these. So
Right.
again, I don't really have a question. I was just really excited by your paper.
I'm glad you shared that with us. For those that are more interested, not just in this moment, but in Eugene's work overall, you should know that he recently published his memoir, which is an excellent read, and he also told me recently that the memoir itself is being turned into a documentary, which will come, I hope, soon. And they have a very informative website. It's just an amazing series of successes that he and his many collaborators have had in that community over decades now.
Sorry, I selfishly grabbed the microphone, not the phone, from her to ask a question. I wanted to know if in the 1990s, you know, in this revival, there were any contestations of authenticity, because I feel like after the Jaranero movement took hold, there was a lot of conflict and a lot of issues, and it seems like they were more vibing to anything that would help their cause for the revivalist movement. And I didn't know if you could speak a little bit on what it was like then and how it kind of maybe transitioned out of that in the post-revival movement of Son Jarocho, both in Mexico and the United States.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, an excellent question. Yes, there certainly was and still is contestation within the scenes, plural, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. But to be maybe oversimplified a little bit, but I think one of the things that was so important about this historical moment, and particularly this album, is that Gilberto, who had been the kind of figurehead of the movement itself, is here doing something that's quite free and, you know, and in so many ways, not in all respects, but in so many ways outside of the tradition. So the implication that a lot of younger people, and there are a lot of like more contemporary sounding, not necessarily fusion, but more contemporary sounding Jarocho groups that were forming in the 90s during this very period. And for them, this album was a statement to say, if you have the knowledge, if you're well-grounded, if you grew up in the tradition or you spent enough time learning it, it's like now you can paint outside the lines. And that's okay, because that innovation is itself part of the tradition. And it's something that we all collectively need to do if we're going to preserve this whole endeavor. How that plays out now is that, you know, there is still Jarocho fusion. It sounds and feels different now because the things that it's fusing with are different. There's more hip hop influence, there's more EDM influence, cumbia influences of various kinds. But the idea that Jarocho musicians, there's something built in, there's a kind of built-in flexibility to Son Jarocho being a fusion even originally that allows it to take all these different forms. But there are still staunch traditionalists within the communities, and ironically, there's also now, I think, a growing viewpoint that the Jarocho Blanco is its own kind of tradition that should be treated not as just, you know, this kind of commercialized anomaly, but its own thing. So there are now traditionalists who want to harken back to the Jarocho Blanco, which is, I mean, these things just keep turning in cycles as revival movements typically do.
Thank you so much. It's so fascinating. And I am not a practitioner, so I'm like completely
Time for one more question if anybody has one.
Hi, Nick. Thank you.
Hi, Nancy.
Thank you for the great paper.
Thank you.
I'm just on mute to me, but it sounds just another question of crossover. I wonder whether there's any kind of this Jarocho movement or sound that enter into the concert classical kind of a stage.
Yes, there has been. One of the things that I kind of alluded to at various times in this presentation, and if you start looking at the Jarocho literature or talk to people like Eugene and Gilberto, one of the things that they will inevitably bring out about Son Jarocho in the largest sense is the connections to Spanish Baroque music in the instruments, in the textures, in various things. So there have been a few projects that tried to demonstrate and bring that out and celebrate that in a very explicit way. There's an album, sorry, I can't remember the name of the album itself, but it's with Jordi Zabal, the famous early music Spanish conductor, where he's got a bunch of early music specialists playing sones, playing the traditional sones and demonstrating that connection. In terms of something like, I don't know, a requinto concerto with a full orchestra. There's nothing like that to my knowledge. But some of the Mexican nationalist composers have drawn on some of this material. Moncayo most famously with the Huapango movement, which the nomenclature is a little bit confusing on that, but it's most of the actual melodic content that's woven through the orchestral texture is from the song tradition of Southern Veracruz, the Jarocho tradition. So there are a few examples of that, yeah.
I think some of those people were at Harvard recently.
Is that right?
Early music,
Yeah.
players.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, there's also even the Jarocho instruments, for the most part, particularly the jaranas, which are the strummed chordophones, and the requinto, which is roughly the same size and more of a melodic instrument. Those are built generally by people within the community, by people who are active as performers and so on in some way, including Gilberto himself is a very fine luthier, as is his brother, Ramon. There's a trend, I guess you could say, not necessarily new, but over maybe the last 15 or 20 years, to design, at least superficially, cosmetically, to make some of those instruments look more Baroque. That is, with certain kinds of decorated bridges and things that are drawn from the inspiration of 16th, 17th century Spanish guitars, vihuelas, that sort of thing. So you'll see that at fandangos. It's like, oh, this guy looks like he's playing a Baroque guitar, and in some ways he is, because there's a very direct line of connection there. All right, we are out of time for my part of the presentation, so we're going to switch now over to, thank you. While Lauren's getting connected, I'm going to introduce you to her. This is Dr. Lauren Salazar, is an associate professor of music and the founding director of the Musical Humanities Institute and director of the mariachi program at Tarleton State University in Texas. Her research focuses on the mariachi tradition in the United States and Mexico. She is a practicing mariachi musician, performing on the mariachi harp, and is a member of the all-female, two-time Grammy Award-winning Mariachi Divas de Cindy Shea. Dr. Salazar served as cultural advisor on the Oscar and Golden Globe-winning Disney Pixar film, Coco. Most recently, she served as the mariachi consultant for the United States Postal Service Mariachi Forever Stamp Series 2022, and as a member of the Texas Music Adjudicators Association, TMAA. She has served as a judge for the UIL Mariachi competition since its inception, as an evaluator for the Texas Music Educators Association Mariachi programs also. She holds a BA from Carleton College in music and her MA and PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of California, Los Angeles. And Dr. Salazar is going to speak to us today about her topic on the rise of Mexican regional music in the United States. So welcome, Lauren Salazar.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for waking up and coming to this panel. So there have been many waves of Latin music booms in the United States in the 20th century. Many of these booms have focused primarily on popular musics in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean islands, like mambo, cha-cha-cha, later salsa, merengue, bachata, reggaeton, and many others. Artists, like the kings of mambo from the 1940s, Perez Prado and Tito Puente, and later artists like the salsa queen Celia Cruz and salsa king Hector Lavoe from the 1960s and 70s, and into the 1990s and early 2000s, artists like Ricky Martin, Mark Anthony, and many others showcase the dominance of musical styles whose roots emerge from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other islands, and then take on a new life in the United States. These are the styles that became popular beyond their diasporic communities, largely located in cities like Miami, New York, on the East Coast throughout the 20th century. While these early Latin musical waves have helped to popularize music in Spanish into the American mainstream, it has largely ignored one of the largest Spanish-speaking demographics in the United States, the Mexican diaspora. With the exception of Richie Valens' big hit La Bamba in 1955, Mexican music has largely been considered a niche music. In the 1980s and 1990s, Tejano music in Texas became more popular and did gain some mainstream traction with the success of Tejana superstar Selena, who was murdered before she had the chance to become a household name. Along the US-Mexico border in states like California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, the majority of Latinos are of Mexican heritage. Many musical styles flow back and forth across the border. Since 2018, what is known as the Mexican regional music movement has grown in popularity, and I would argue that since 2022, the styles of musics associated with the Mexican regional moniker has gone mainstream in the United States, as is evidenced by streaming data and where artists' music is playing on the Billboard Hot 100 over the last few years. Where I am still compiling and analyzing this data, it is evident that the popularity and demand for Mexican regional music continues to grow. Mexican regional music's rise in popularity has caught the attention of major music labels in the United States. Banda, norteño, and mariachi are the three main genres that encompass the Mexican regional music boom. All three genres have their roots in the 19th century, primarily in rural and working class communities in Mexico. Artists in both Mexico and the United States are blending these traditional styles. Excuse me. Okay. Okay, artists in both Mexico and the United States are blending these traditional styles with hip-hop, rap, rock, and jazz, while others prefer to keep their traditional folk roots. These three styles are also going through a process of institutionalization within academic music programs along the US and Mexican border regions. Within the academic context, these music programs focus on three traditional genres and serve as a reclamation of culture for Mexican American youth who participate in them. In this paper, I explore the intricate politics of representation of these genres in their new context in terms of education and the music industry at large. In this slide is a short news segment originating from New York, which is better known for its Puerto Rican and Dominican diasporas, and where music from the Caribbean is most popular. However, as this news segment shows, Mexican regional has even become popular in New York City.
There's a new Latin music revolution, regional Mexican music, and you may have heard some of it lately because it is everywhere. It is a fresh take on a classic genre of music, updated with an edgier style that's big on both sides of the southern border. But it's even taking off right here in New York, complementing popular Puerto Rican and Dominican and other Latin artists, thanks to some very catchy collaborations. Here's Eyewitness News reporter Sonia Rincon.
A young generation of artists like Peso Pluma and Eslabón Armado with hits like Ella Baila Sola are climbing Latin music charts, riding the hip new regional Mexican wave, hitting Latin music radio playlists here in New York. Here at 93.1 Amor Radio, DJ Gloria B says even in a city where salsa, merengue, bachata, and reggaeton reign supreme, the Latin American diaspora is getting swept up in the regional Mexican movement.
Peso Pluma, of course, came along and just changed everything. And now he even has a new hairstyle that everybody wants to have his hairstyle.
His rising popularity and that of the genre noted recently at the VMAs.
It's going global. I mean, it's breaking barriers, and I'm just.
So, although Mexican regional music in its newest incarnation has been gaining popularity since 2018, 2023 was a pivotal year for Mexican regional music in the United States, as many news articles and news stories were covered in multiple trade magazines and major media outlets.
There's a new
Good Morning America did two features in 2023 for Hispanic Heritage Month that focused on various aspects of the Mexican regional movement. The first focused on Eslabón Armado's breakout hit, Ella Baila Sola.
Now celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month with the band Eslabón Armado, the first Música Mexicana group to hit #1 on Billboard's Global 200 chart, and this morning they are making history as the first regional Mexican band ever to perform here on GMA. Yes, we are so thrilled about that. Pedro, you are the lead singer for the group. Welcome. It's so nice to have all of you here with us. What is it like to reach this milestone?
I think it's a blessing for us. It's totally another feeling for us that we've been on other shows, but I think this is one of the most important ones for us. I remember going to school and always seeing my teachers always putting the Good Morning American show. So it's kind of like, it feels weird being here.
Any teachers say hi?
And then other non-Hispanic artists like Snoop Dogg have been proponents of Mexican regional music by collaborating with Mexican artists. The 2020 hit Que Maldición featuring Snoop Dogg and Banda Más received number 4 on Billboard's Hot US Latin chart and number 2 on the Billboard's US Regional Mexican Airplay chart. Snoop Dogg raps a little bit later. Eslabon Armado's music is an example of a new genre known as música sirena, and that is influenced and blends the instrumentation and song forms from older Mexican genres like música norteña and banda sinaloense. Música norteña has its roots in the 19th century northern Mexican borderlands and was heavily influenced by the musics and instruments that German and Eastern European immigrants brought with them. These ensembles consist of tololoche, an acoustic double bass or electric bass, the bajo sexto, a 12-string acoustic guitar, the accordion, button or keyed, and some styles use the saxophone with modified wooden reeds for metallic reeds that sit enclosed inside metal mouthpiece fixtures. Percussion sections include variations from full drum kits to a reduced snare drum and redoble duo. The following is an example of a dance competition in Tamaulipas featuring a música norteña group with a standard instrumentation and performance aesthetic. Also has its roots in the 19th century and was heavily influenced by European military bands. This is an example of a banda. So note the distinctive tunings and instruments being played out of range. Additionally, the drumming patterns create a distinctive syncopation that marks off musical sections. As mentioned earlier, música sirena blends these styles, and some groups add electronic instruments such as electric bass and tololoche. Música sirena emerged in the 1990s from the northern Mexican states of Sinaloa, Sonora, and Chihuahua, as well as being popular within U.S. border states. With the rise of its popularity, sirena music has gone global in a very short amount of time.
period of time.
Sierreño music is Mexican regional music that has its roots in corridos that date back to the 1800s. The corrido is storytelling by songs that can span generations. These songs highlight working class struggles while striving to make the best out of life, love, and even times of war. Even as they incorporate new styles, Gen Z Sierreño musicians preserve the corrido essence, from love and heartbreak to social commentary and the Mexican-American lived experience. They're also
Mariachi music is also one of the genres associated with the regional Mexican music phenomenon in the United States. With roots in the 18th century in the central western region of Mexico, mariachi music underwent a process of urbanization in Mexico City in the early part of the 20th century, and it is this urbanized style of mariachi that has become popular worldwide. Good Morning America also featured a segment focused on mariachi music during Hispanic Heritage Month in 2023.
Mariachi is an integral part of Hispanic culture. It's seeing a revival across the country. And John Keeners is here to celebrate it all. And John, you were master of ceremonies at a mariachi competition in your hometown of San Antonio.
That's right, man. It's a big deal, George, down in San Antonio. They do this every single year. Mariachi music has been the soundtrack of my life. And today, mariachi is seeing a rebirth across the country. Now, a new generation is discovering the joys of the music and the culture. You're going to meet one of those new stars in a moment, Eduardo, and hear him perform. But first, take a look at this. It's the music that echoes the culture and history of the Mexican and Mexican-American people.
You might have a mariachi at your first communion, a wedding, a divorce, at your funeral. Mariachi music tends to follow a person throughout the course of their life.
And while the COVID-19 pandemic had a devastating impact on this community-driven music, a revival is now underway with the explosion of mariachi school programs and social media, bringing the sound to a wider audience. All female bands like Mariachi Divas have changed the face of what was once traditionally seen as a male-dominated genre. Hi.
So both this segment on mariachi music and Escalón Armado was the first time in Good Morning America's history that showcased and committed entire segments to Mexican regional music. The following is an example of a popular or famous mariachi song, Volver, Volver, sung by the Mexican artist Alejandro Fernandez and Mark Anthony, a famous Puerto Rican salsa singer at a sold-out concert. Alejandro Fernandez is the son of the mega superstar singer Vicente Fernandez. Mariachi Divas de Cindy Shea is an all-female, two-time Grammy Award-winning mariachi group based in Los Angeles. In 2024, they were signed with Warner Music, becoming the first mariachi group in history to sign with a major record label in the United States. 2024 also marked the 25th anniversary of Mariachi Divas, and they had the opportunity to collaborate with Latin pop star Becky G on the single Bluetooth, which continues to rise on the charts.
I am currently a part-time member of Mariachi Divas, having joined the group in 2015, playing the arpa jalisciense. The group has grown tremendously in popularity and today has massive commercial appeal, which is very much a reflection of the group's leader, Cindy Shea's vision. She initially had to create her own label 25 years ago, since none of the major labels were interested in mariachi, let alone an all-female mariachi group. Through persistence, hard work, and creativity, the group has 11 Grammy nominations and 2 Grammy wins.
Yo que pensaba que así era, que estar solita era lo mío y las últimas primaveras me las pasé muerta de frío. Sin avisar llegaste tú, conectamos como Bluetooth y ahora por ti mi corazón hace tum tum.
The commercial appeal with that cumbia. All right, so as the commercial appeal and popularity is being recognized by major recording labels, the media, and now mainstream America, Mexican regional music is also having an impact on music education, especially in parts of the United States that have large Mexican diasporic communities. In Downey, California, Osvaldo Zárate, a middle school band director, has started teaching banda music to his students. This was one of few videos I could find of banda music in the schools. However, I am aware that there are other schools and band directors who are interested in incorporating banda into their programs. Along the Texas-Mexico border, música norteña is incredibly popular in high schools in southern Texas, conjunto ensembles, the instrumentation that performs música norteña thrive. Palmville High School initiated its award-winning program in 2008, and as you'll see in the following example, the school has its own recording studio, and the students make their own music videos as a part of their curriculum. And then I'm going to end with mariachi music. So while mariachi has a much longer history in schools across the United States, in Texas, there are many organizations that put on conferences, and they're just growing. I don't have time to read the rest of my paper, but they are growing in popularity. And so I will end playing an example of Roma High School, who wins every competition. This was them at a major competition, very competitive in Texas.
The next mariachi in Conference 5 is Roma High School. Directing the Roma High School mariachi is Eloy Garza, their principal Marisa Belmontes, and their superintendent Carlos Guzman. Their program includes Tema y México, Lo que un día fue, no será, y Mi Tierra Linda. Roma High School, you may begin your performance for the 2016 UIL State Mariachi Festival.
Investigating the rise in popularity of regional Mexican music in the United States marks a new research project for me that is very much in its beginning stages. As someone who has been active in mariachi music with my family since 1980, I am thrilled that there is more interest, as we are now in what I would characterize as a hostile political environment where education is under attack and where the perception that certain academic programs are wasteful. The lucrative American recording industry that has embraced Mexican regional music only demonstrates the need for trained musicians and new artists. Many of the recently signed Música Sirena artists are young, between the ages of 18 and 25. Additionally, as there are more Mexican regional music programs in schools, there is a need for qualified teachers and programs that can qualify teachers. As the Mexican regional music movement continues to grow, it'll be interesting to see what new styles and developments will emerge. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. That was a wonderful overview of what's happening right now in these areas, musical areas. Questions, comments, anybody? Sandy?
Thanks for this overview. I'm wondering, as music education spreads and people who are not of Mexican heritage are learning these traditions, do you foresee conflicts about appropriation or, cultural ownership?
It's already happening. It's been happening for years in mariachi, but definitely with the conjunto and banda as well. And I think it just has to do with different approaches in music education. So whenever I've been asked to consult with music educators, as an ethnomusicologist, I get very annoyed at certain things, but I realize for a lot of music education folks, their heart is in the right place. And so one of the things that I really try to advocate for is the use of consultants and the use and working with the communities who make the music. And some of the music education folks I talk to completely get it and are already doing that. Others, oh, we can do that, right? So I really think it's important, especially for those of us who do ethnomusicology and field work, to work with music education. Because again, we don't always collaborate with each other. But yeah, that's definitely been an issue. And in Texas, you have a lot of orchestra, band teachers who are being told to teach mariachi and they have no experience with that genre. Or on the flip side, you will have school districts that'll hire a mariachi person who maybe never graduated from high school themselves and don't really understand how the school day works and things of that sort. So it's really a wonderful research area right now that we're living through a lot of these negotiations of how to do this, because the interest and the demand is there. Thank you.
Other questions?
No.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that awesome paper. I think you and I have talked about the overlap between Mariachi Divas and Valeria Carlos, who is a member of Mariachi Divas, and she and I started an all-female Mexican, it started off as like a Mexican chamber group, like trio, cuarteto, and now that Valeria and I have moved away, it's in its second generation, and they've turned it into an all-female mariachi, because there was a demand for that in Colorado, specifically. But I actually wanted to ask you about the term Mexican regional music or regional Mexican music, because when you put up that Forbes article, not too long ago, I got an email from the Wall Street Journal, of all places, wanting to talk to me about regional Mexican music, and the first thing they asked me was, which is it? And what is it? Is it regional Mexican music, or is it Mexican regional music? And I froze, because I was like, I don't know, it's like, it's the same thing to me, but it's marketed in different ways, and is it like, regional, música regional mexicana, or like, so I freaked out, and of course, like, I'm supposed to be the expert, but that was like the moment where I was just like, oh my god, I don't know. So I didn't know if you could talk about that, how it's being marketed in the US versus in Mexico.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Part of that is a direct translation, música regional, right? But I also think too, it's really interesting, because you're right. Some of the recording labels will call it regional Mexican music, or Mexican regional music, and I think it depends on whether they're trying to market to a mostly Hispanic audience versus a more mainstream audience, but it's such a subtle difference. And even in the media, the articles and stuff I was looking at, it's all over the place. So it's kind of interchangeable as well. But even in talking about the different song forms and styles, it's all over the place, especially when you have, you know, The Atlantic or Billboard or Rolling Stones not knowing the difference between norteño and banda and putting weird instrumentation. So there's just not a lot out there, and I think that just has to do with the paucity of research in English on these areas that have largely been ignored. So I am hoping that with the popularity that, you know, in the past Mexicans were not exotic, I hope that now there's more interest in American scholarship in these Mexican genres, because it's sorely needed. Yeah, thank you.
Just to look at this from a different music industry perspective, I believe, maybe you know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the Recording Academy just did another reshuffling of some of their categories and definitions. Yeah. But I think they separated out Mexican regional music from some other categories that might have overlapped with it. In other words, I think there was an effort, I don't know that it was completely successful, but there was an effort to take Peso Pluma and other, you know, really big commercial powerhouse groups across a range of genres and styles, but separate them out from some of these less commercially powerful, folk-oriented groups, both within and outside of the Latino tradition.
As of 2024, that hadn't happened, but it was definitely discussion, because in 2026, in 2016, the regional music category, Mexican regional music category almost went away, and then it reemerged. They also plunked in Tejano music that used to have its own category is now plunked in there. So it's always changing. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the change with Tejano music, I think, was a reflection of the fact that the glory days of Celano and Emilio had faded away.
But they could come back.
Right, yeah. So, well, thanks again, Lauren. Let's all thank her for this wonderful presentation. And we're going to move to our last presenter of the panel. He's getting connected here. This is Chris Batterman-Chairez, who is an ethnographer and ethnomusicologist from Mexico City. His current book project is an ethnographic study of the intercalations of music and power in Michoacan, Mexico. The book takes Purépecha music as a passageway for probing the temporal and felt regimes of multicultural governance for indigenous communities. His second large-scale project is an ethnographic study of media ecosystems and cartel violence in rural Mexico. And Chris is going to speak to us today about Blood and Cinder, music, media, and ordinary violence in Mexico. Let's welcome Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for that introduction. I think this is a very different side to some of the music that Lauren was just talking about, and I'm going to kill the vibe a little bit. And I apologize for that. We'll get started. Michoacan 2022. My friend Nado reached over and turned down the radio. We were sitting in a small wooden shack out behind a village fiesta that his orquesta had been hired to play in his rural indigenous Purépecha village in the highlands of Michoacan. The radio had been playing the recently popular corrido tumbado by Mexican-American musician Victor Cibrian entitled On the Radio a Cop in el Radio en Cochinero, the lyrics of which graphically narrate the encounter between drug traffickers and police. The accompanying music video features an armored Cibrian sporting a bulletproof vest and surrounded by armored vehicles. We'll listen to a little bit of that now. Nava and I had been chatting about other things during the break while the younger musicians, all young indigenous men, sat eating behind us. One of them started singing another corrido tumbado by Mexican singer Peso Pluma entitled PRC. The acronym in the title stands for literally powder, wheels, crystal, but also for, colloquially speaking, cocaine, weed, and meth. Oscar, one of the teens in the orchestra, sang the first part of the song, clearly stuck in his head.
Me levanto un baño y luego me pongo a forjar. Es veneno da para arriba de muy buena calidad. Los teléfonos no paran nunca de sonar. Tienes alguna prevista porque un que te quiere más. De bien parado los paquetes van. Estoy pendiente, no puedo fallar. Siempre estoy listo para cruzar.
I hate that song, Nava said to me, but it's everywhere and it's so catchy. A few hours later, on our drive back to Nava's village, I caught him humming the same tune. This paper is about a media constellation emerging around this popular music genre of corridos tumbados, literally toppled ballads, and a particular aesthetic I call lo bellico, or the bellicose, that has overtaken airwaves, music charts, and news cycles in both the United States and Mexico. Spearheaded by popular artists like Peso Pluma, Fuerza Regida, and many others, these songs and their associated forms of media, music videos, television series, movies, and even fashion lines, sing of drugs and drug runners, cartels and canonized narcos, and of the lucrative and luxurious lifestyles promised by these vocational paths, all of which end, as one of the more famous recent corridos put it, in dying bellicosely. In some ways, corridos tumbados are a new iteration of two older phenomena. First, of narco-corridos that would accompany regional kingpins, and which sang of cruel deeds turned acts of heroism or violence rendered valor. And second, of an international romanticization of narco-culture and its charms through media such as the narco series. But my interest in the networked infrastructures of corrido tumbado is precisely for the particular historical conjuncture in and through which it circulates, and what all of this means for the current era of national politics in Mexico, the so-called war on drugs. The target of my analysis is less this media ecology than it is the mediated political culture of violence and insecurity felt in parts of Mexico. The war on drugs is difficult to pin down epistemically. This is due to the murkiness of its actors, the shadowiness of their movements, and the secrecy of their motivations, and the ways in which cartel violence and state violence, not to mention the quote-unquote good guys and the bad guys, are nearly indistinguishable at any given moment. Indeed, there has been a broad reconstitution of local social orders in Mexico over the last 19 years. Rural residents widely accept the premise that cartels and state forces are two sides of the same coin. And living in this war is complicated. People move with ambivalence and uncertainty, beset by contradiction. In one moment, individuals might condemn cartels, and in another they might be humming a popular tune that romanticizes the bellicose allure of these same criminal organizations. They might deny association, only to later explain how they do favors for someone to quote-unquote stay on his good side. And no one is immune to being accused of being involved, even say an urban ethnomusicologist from Mexico City. This is what all the narratives of the drug war currently on offer by scholars, journalists, and politicians fail to get around. If the war is already hard enough to explain, especially for those of us that attempt to do so from a distance, then it is even harder, more painful, and more agonizing to try and live through. What follows begins to examine the space of epistemic murk and the ways it is attenuated through the circulation and consumption of bellicose media. It is through this media that the sense of the bellicose ordinary comes to be experienced by those that feel interpolated and are made to feel interpolated within the war. I first lay out the experience of violence and its remediations, and then probe the entailments of this media as it reveals the vertiginous edge between rural indigenous life and the state in one of Mexico's most afflicted regions, Michoacán. Specifically, I organize my thoughts around the figures of blood and cinder, two images that have been impressed upon me during my over 2 years of fieldwork in the region. These figures reveal the way that the drug war is experienced as a structural antinomy that tacks between spectacle and speculation, confession and rumor, fact and conspiracy. My broader argument is that this poses a set of complex questions about the state and its constitutive violences. I'll revisit this in concluding, But for now, I'll go back to where it all started. Uruapan, Michoacan, 2006. The conflict started in Michoacan. It was here that a group of gunmen stormed a crowded nightclub and rolled 5 severed heads onto the dance floor in a show of cruelty that would provoke then-President Felipe Calderón to mobilize the Mexican army. The attackers, later identified as part of the Michoacan-based La Familia cartel, left a note. La Familia doesn't kill for money. It doesn't kill women. It doesn't kill innocent people, only those who deserve to die. Let it be known. This was an inflection point for the illicit economy of narcos and narcotics. Not only had La Familia announced itself as a new major player, not only had the logics of violence changed drastically, not only did a new conflict begin that would, over the next 19 years, kill over 250,000 and disappear countless more, but the national and international headlines that these 5 severed heads triggered resulted in a new iteration of the drug trade as an intensely mediatized and compellingly opaque phenomenon in the Mexican and global imaginaries. The war on drugs would become the war on drugs. Of course, in Michoacan and Mexico more broadly, the exact contours of the war have changed over these 19 years. After its leader Nazario Moreno was killed by the rival Sinaloan cartel, La Familia was defeated and eventually absorbed by a newer and even bloodier newcomer, the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Today's motivations are slightly different too. The emphasis on narcotics has given way to cartel cash crops like avocados and berries that can be grown year-round in Michoacan. And new generations similarly came onto the scene in gory fashion. In 2019, the cartel hung 19 mutilated bodies of the last rival group from a bridge in Uruapan, along with a poster that read, "Beautiful people, go on with your day." Michoacan was where the drug war started in 2006, and in 2019, Michoacan was where it was announced to be far from over. The events of 2006 and 2019 signaled 2 distinct moments in the drug war, both wrapped up in a frenzy of mediations. Not only did slews of headlines and reports come out of Uruapan, but the allure of the drug war began to circulate in media like the Narco series and popular and charismatic figures like El Chapo Guzman, and in the romanticization of the bandido or bandit figure that has a long history in Mexico. Today, like in 2006, an economy of bloody images is propagated across all media technologies. And this owes also to the fact that Mexican media often publishes very nearly uncensored images of mutilated bodies, severed heads, burned remains, you name it. Media theorist Thomas Lamar would call all of this a media ecology, which takes form through and with the distributive forces of circulation in its materials, the coursing energies of which allows for cuts and segmentations that generate flows. Music is of course implemented too. In 2006, narco corridos circulated in informal music sharing economies across the border, and in 2019, corridos tumbados were becoming popular. The difference here is the scope of listenership. Corridos tumbados quickly rose to the top of the charts, and artists like Peso Pluma have become some of the most listened to Mexican artists of all time. The bellicose media ecology in 2020's Michoacan addresses a wider public of ordinary people pulled into the ambit of the violent war. Lyrically, certain themes are observable. There are often direct references to violence or warfare in songs that narrate battle with the police, military, or with rival cartels. Explicit allusions to cartels are common, such as 701 or JGL being readily legible references to El Chapo, as are more subtle references such as the Blue Angel wordplay or wordplay around chapiza, which means El Chapo's followers. Other songs will directly take up themes of moving drugs, or in some cases partaking in drug use, and the more innocent of these songs will reference the upward mobility associated with the bellico lifestyle, from humble origins on ranches to Mercedes, Balenciaga, Gucci, Patek Philippe, all common name drops in corridos tumbados. During my fieldwork in Michoacan, these songs formed a dependable backdrop to daily life in the region. They were, as Nava said in my opening to this paper, really everywhere. On cheap transistor radios owned by indigenous residents, on the AM and FM radios of private cars or in microbuses, on cheap Chinese-made smartphones that people would use to access YouTube, and on inexpensive JBL speakers that young people would carry with them everywhere. Even Purépecha orquestas were implicated. While I was performing for several, we would get requests for Peso Pluma on a nightly basis. But for all of the enjoyment that comes with this media, violence is never far in the offing. Stories of attacks or threats against artists are widely reported on. For instance, in 2023, Peso Pluma had to cancel much of his Mexican tour after threats from the New Generation cartel in Tijuana in response to his having sung too much about the rival cartel. And more locally, many of the listeners that enjoy this music are themselves caught up in the drug trade as runners, and violence would break out with an alarming frequency in indigenous villages, or especially on the dark highways between them. The situation is the status quo still, the bellicose ordinary. The pervasiveness of this media in daily life reflects the pervasiveness of the drug war, but it also renders it perceptible for rural residents, inescapable almost. The coordinates of the ordinary become suffused with violence, raising important questions about the relationship between the drug war's crushing weight and the dilemmas its remediation entails. On the one hand, this media produces what anthropologist Shailene Newman calls the narco-uncanny. The simultaneous experience of the conflict is both strange and familiar. The experience of the conflict, or the uncanny here, captures the range of ambivalent attachments and intensities that come with living through this war as rural indigenous people who are often interpolated into it by outside narratives. On the other hand, this media gives rise to a murkier perceptibility. As much as it makes the war and its violences known, it makes its determinant forces unknown. Okumichu 2024. The car was eerily quiet as we made our way down a dark dirt road, flanked on either side by berry fields. We were coming back from a gig in Okumichu, a Purépecha village in the mountains of Michoacán, and were traversing an area just south of Zamora, where los malosos, or the bad guys, live. If they kill us, they'll kill us güerito and all, joked the driver Ramiro about my presence as the güerito, the white guy. Except it wasn't all that much of a joke. He was staring straight ahead, nervously into the night, his hands almost trembling on the wheel. Don't say that, clipped his wife Vero from the back seat. We'll be fine. Their 3 kids sat still next to her. They were told to keep their heads down. Ramiro and Vero's exchange would have been unnerving if it weren't for the fact that I'd already experienced the worst during my fieldwork. Shootouts, kidnappings, extortions, wounded friends. But it was all the more unnerving because I knew what they were referring to. Not even 15 days earlier, our friend Israel, a Purépecha musician from a neighboring village to Ramiro's, was forcibly disappeared on the same road that we were on. He was also coming back from a gig. Accounts of the disappearance ranged. In some, his car was forced off the road by a large black ghost car full of armed men. In others, he was stopped at a checkpoint set up by the cartel, where the unspeakable had happened. His body was never found. It was well past 3 in the morning when we ourselves were on that same road, and sure enough, rounding a shadowy corner, we came across our own checkpoint of armed men. These are the fuckers that got Israel, Ramiro said. We held our breaths as they beckoned our windows down and shined flashlights in the back. We're musicians, Ramiro told them. This one is from Chicago, he said, gesturing over to me. I stayed quiet. Ramiro had asked me many months prior to pretend to be a foreigner and deny speaking Spanish in cases like this, assuming that my whiteness and my ostensible foreignness would offer some protection for his family. His assumptions were well-founded. Wide-eyed, the gunman motioned us through. Harming a foreigner would be too much of a scandal. Ramiro started back towards his village. He turned up the radio again, and we listened to the latest corrido tumbados. Life in war-torn Michoacán is full of questions and rumors. Residents of Purépecha villages are always replete with stories they've heard of attacks, kidnappings, killings, and disappearances. Often these stories are displaced. Over there are where the malosos are. Over there is mafioso territory. Importantly, these stories are also vague. One never knows who is involved or how, or why violence falls upon certain people. The way that Corrido Tumbao has established such a stronghold in Michoacán only makes these things harder to ascertain. One never quite knows if the young man walking around playing these songs is merely doing so because he enjoys them, or if he is also involved. I say this not to indict the young people that find themselves listening to these songs daily, because this is the calculus that structures everyday movement in and through rural Michoacán. The level of distress also stems from perceptions of violence in the region. Official state narratives paint the conflict as bad guys killing bad guys, but speak to any resident and things become more complicated. Suddenly, violence appears as a web, strewn among and between actors and agents that should constitute different sides, but that in practice become indistinguishable. The drug war's violences are spectral ones. For those agents and victims of violence in Michoacan with which I've worked, violence gets reproduced in and through a realm of terror constituted by narratives and discourses, rumors, speculation, gossip, talk, circulating within a lively but ambivalent public sphere. Only in this case, the public sphere is the bellicose media ecology. That is, this violence is engendered in the images of bodies or heads on front pages of newspapers, and threatening notes or banners left by cartels, in the stories of disappeared friends or gossip about dissolved bodies, in music videos that display dangerous weapons or thrilling battles, and in songs that sing of charismatic narcos and their motives. This media enacts something of a space of fantasy and gives violence its imprecision and spectrality that both constitutes and disrupts the order of normality. Violence becomes a cinder, there burning and then gone. There is more to be said, of course, but I want to end by rendering the figures of blood and cinder again in starker terms. Blood and cinder capture two axes along which the drug war is mediated and experienced in Michoacan. First, as a spectacular and pervasive presence that is visibilized and known as such, blood. And second, as a spectral and evasive presence that is felt and feared but never known explicitly, cinder. This media ecology intervenes in the drug war for rural indigenous communities that are themselves forced to navigate both blood and cinder, figuratively and literally, and their respective remediations. But these figures point to something else. Indeed, my interest in this larger study is not just to probe the complexities and contradictions of drug trafficking in Michoacan, but also to pursue a broader ethnographic account of the ways these localized dimensions interdict the shifting ontological and epistemological grounds of the Mexican state. Its violent operations in forms of marginalization, as well as how it weighs upon rural indigenous subjects and creates cuts in the fabric of the social. That is, the mediations of blood and cinder reveal the structural antinomy through which the state is felt as at once murky and imprecise, but also crushingly palpable, magnetized in the coordinates of ordinary life. This all cuts against common understandings of the state. Classical ideas of the state as rationalist bureaucracy or as legitimized through criminality, like those of Weber or Durkheim, run aground here, where instead what we see is a state that is both constituted and experienced in registers of affect or uncertainty. And recent theorizations of the state that attend to its magical properties, like those of Michael Taussig, don't completely account for the way that the state's magic is not undone by unmasking the legitimacy of the state, diagnosing this magic as an effective power, that is, but is instead proliferated as speculations are remediated in just about any area of everyday life. Instead, we see something akin to what Walter Benjamin described long ago in his essay on violence, an ambiguity resulting from the blurring of law and violence at the heart of the modern state, a no man's land where uncertainty reigns and disavowed violences flourish. This flourishing violence is the bellicose ordinary for these residents of Michoacan. In this media ecology, where bloody images accumulate force as they circulate and are consumed, violence gets materialized, produced, and experienced through a phantomatic mode of production. This is a mode of production that effectuates the state and the cartel as fetishes of each other, constructing reality as an endless play of mirror images. These images tack between two poles, revealing on the one hand the violent jouissance or pleasure of the state, the spectacular moments of bloody conflict that play out in the headlines and in bellicose media like music, and on the other hand the spectral presence of the state, the ways in which bodies and their absences get produced through obscured actors and their uncanny agencies, as well as through charred ashes. This configures a political culture wherein violence establishes the infrastructure of the ordinary, and where it operates as an exchange currency for transactions in law and life. This endless hall of mirrors is an apt metaphor for the contemporary Mexican state, itself marred in contradictions that force subjects to constantly recognize and misrecognize themselves and others. And what of popular music and media? In this model, the bellicose imagery of Correo Tumbao is, in a rather broad sense, a mediation, a process of linking institutions with individuals or social structures with single subjects. My point is not just that the music and media reflect the structural antinomies of the Mexican state and how its wars weigh on indigenous rural subjects, but rather that music and media are key sites through which subjects come to feel these weights. This is something of a phenomenological approach to the question of sovereignty and what it means to live within it, be it your own or the state's. Media does all this by providing something of a public sphere for talk in all its forms about the state and the war. for discourses, narratives, rumors, and images to proliferate and gain force. The name I'm ascribing to the downstream effects of this talk, the bellicose ordinary, is here less important than the simple fact that this media shapes the experience of the drug war and its concomitant violences for rural residents of Michoacan. And it illuminates something of the complexities and contradictions of social life in states of terror, uncertainty, and insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that powerful paper. Do you have any questions, comments?
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I just have a question for you regarding like temporality and also, okay, so basically like, do you see corridos tumbados as like an extension of like this longer history of narco corridos? Because one interesting thing like that I've seen is almost a bit of the opposite of what you're describing, in that, you know, during like the Peña Nieto years, like a lot of like the corridos bélicos were like really explicitly violent, right? And we're sort of centering that violence. And then when you see like the Sierreño boom, like you see a lot of, like I'm thinking of like composers like El Obama or like Junior H, who like sort of write music that's less focused on like narcotráfico, like the drug economy, and more focused on like sort of internal affective states, right? Of like, you know, this whole sort of like exploration of individualized emotion in corridos tumbados that like you don't see, or at least I haven't seen like in previous eras of like Mexican drug war music. So I'm just wondering, like, are you thinking of like corridos tumbados as something new and emerging because it's a boom, or do you see it as like this extension of something that's existed beforehand? Do you see it as different from sort of like the accordion forward, like corridos bélicos that we saw really popular like 10 years ago?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think there definitely is an extension, and I think I said this at the beginning of the paper, is this is kind of a recalibration of the earlier corridos in a way. And I guess the kind of focus that you're pointing to on interior affective states, I think is there, but I think is also a way that it's sort of, you know, part of the reason that it's taken on the kind of allure that it has in the United States, especially, with like Peso Pluma being everywhere, like the news commentator in Lauren's presentation said. Like the kind of, what you're pointing to is, for me, what I see as like a way that they're kind of masking the violence, because the violence is still there. And if you go to like, you know, I did 2 years of fieldwork in Michoacan, you talk to anyone, they understand it as intimately connected to the drug war. And it's like, in a different way than like El Comandante, the you know, early 2000s was doing, where it was very bloody and singing about, you know, killing people in a very violent and grotesque and spectacular way. And here it's like a little different, but even like the more innocent of the songs that are singing about, you know, getting in fancy cars with your luxury watches, there's always little references. One of the big ones, the one that's about a Mercedes, AMG, I think the song is called, ends with like, I'm gonna get in my Mercedes with all these beautiful women, but we gotta be careful because they're coming for us. And that kind of they is the spectral nature that's there. The they could be the state, because you're you know, the implication is that if you have a Mercedes or these watches, it's because you're involved in these things. So to kind of more pointedly answer the question, I think it's definitely an extension of these earlier stuff. It's a recalibration in some ways, and the big difference I'm kind of probing is the way it's just kind of become everywhere in a way that, like El Comandante and the earlier ones, were not just so kind of hyper-present in the lives of like especially young people in rural Mexico, that like Peso Pluma is.
Thank you so much, Chris. You and I have talked about our overlaps, and we'll have plenty more to talk about, but I feel like there's things that might help others that are here to vocalize it and also to build on what J.A. was talking about. I also see it as an extension of the narco corrido, but to point out what J.A. was saying about the Peña Nieto presidency. So this is a presidency before AMLO, who was before Claudia Sheinbaum. So this would have been like the 2000s and, the 2010s. And there's corrido bélicos, which is a genre. So you were talking about the bellicose aesthetic, but there's a genre, like, and you know this too, but just for other people and what Jay had talked about. Corridos bélicos is violent corridos. It is a subgenre of corridos. And there is kind of that incredible violence that Jay was talking about, but there's also this other side of it that is not necessarily what you touched on, but it's the performative part of it in the US, where you have these concerts, even in El Paso, for example, where they're playing El Commander and they're singing these concerts, people bring their rifles with them and bring like artillery with them and kind of glorify this violence. And then you have people who live that for real in Mexico, and there's these very like paradoxical interpretations of violence. There's a glorification and commercialization of violence, and then there's kind of the ordinary violence that you're talking about, which is everyday life. And then speaking on that, I wanted to know, because you had talked about how this was something that you were living because you were doing other field work in Mexico. And I had a similar experience where I was doing other field work, and then they shot 9 people like on the street where I was staying, and fortunately I wasn't there. And it kind of drove my intentional distancing from certain narco corrido or corrido bélico circles, despite its real overlap in my work. And I remember specifically when one Mexican music anthropologist had invited me to a cemetery at night in Sinaloa and said, come and like, you can meet these people, and I said no. And he called me a pollito, which is a chicken. And I was like, I would rather be a chicken than, you know, dead, or be immersed in this. And maybe I was way too scared, but I still stand by what I said. And despite this, by the way, I still respect this Mexican music anthropologist like and his work immensely. It was just kind of that difference in the fact that he is a grown man who can kind of blend in, and I am a 5 foot tall, very white presenting Mexican American. But I wanted to know what you can talk about when your ethnography, your life as an ethnographer intersects with the violent, like ordinary violence, and it wasn't necessarily something that you expected to happen, despite knowing full well what was there.
Yeah, that's a great question, Teresita. Thank you for that. Just on the first bit, I think the thing you're diagnosing with the kind of different interpretations of this music across the border is one of the reasons that I, get really annoyed sometimes when I see the kind of celebratoriness of like Peso Pluma in the US, because it's by people that, have connections, often have connections to Mexico through like family or, second, third generation. But they're also people that like don't live that violence, and they just kind of, like you said, romanticize and glorify, and sometimes like really get into taking, I've seen videos of like people taking their guns and shooting their guns at these things. It's really strange. And the other weird thing is like Peso Pluma was just playing for like the LA Fire Aid Festival, of all things. The second part about ethnography, yeah, this was, this project came about because I was, living there doing work on Pireco, which is an indigenous music of the Purépecha, and just like, part of the ethnography involves playing with different groups, following them through like, because they would get hired to go play in different villages. Oftentimes the drive is like 4 hours each direction, so we do that. And just like living, what they're living, that is in some ways incidental to the music that I was studying, but also not, because like just being a gigging musician in Michoacan, you have to be on dark highways at 3 in the morning, and that is incredibly dangerous. So, this just became a thing that, I had to, and for a while I tried to keep it apart, admittedly for self-preservation reasons. I didn't want to like ask the wrong questions of the wrong people and then get myself in trouble, but then I kind of realized I couldn't, and part of that is also, what you're pointing to is like a difference in kind of positionality of you and this Mexican anthropologist. I had a similar positionality to him, where being a white Mexican from Mexico City in Mexico, in Michoacan, gave me a degree of protection that my indigenous friends didn't have. Like in the story I told, like a large reason we got through that, and my friend who was driving, and that's not actually his name, but my friend who was driving had told me well before that, like, if that ever happens to us, be an American, because they're not going to touch you, and they're not going to touch us because you're with you, or we're with you. So, like, pulling these two projects together for me was a realization of like, one, I can't keep these apart because this is like every part of these people's lives is kind of contoured by, you know, the kind of violences imposed on them by all these kind of multinational factors. And also realizing that like I was in a unique position to do this project and someone had to do it, that I just have to kind of figure that out.
Let's all thank Chris one more time. All the other panelists.